De aquí ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Bend his back in the sun all day. Oh, farmer, get up every day to work his life away. Oh, farmer, so much work with so little pay. Oh, farmer, must be rewarded one of these days. The higgler lives in a mansion, while the farmer lives in a hut. The higgler eats steak and snapper, I said the farmer eats chicken back. The higgler rides in a brother, I said the farmer rides a donkey back. The higgler puts the money in the bank, while the farmer ties his little knot. I said, oh, farmer, bend his back in the sun all day. Oh, farmer, get up every day to work his life away. Oh, farmer, so much work with so little pay. Oh, farmer, he must be rewarded one of these days.
Shout out to all the farmers in the global south around the world who feed and nourish us, who provide us with high quality food, drinks, and nutritious value. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Unmasking Imperialism, episode 59, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, we're talking about junk food and empire, talking about the interconnection between junk food and imperialism. We're going to talk about how multinational corporations based in Western countries like the US, Canada, Europe are inundating the global South with processed poison. We're going to talk about the impact physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally that junk food has on the health and well-being of working class peoples, especially global South working class peoples, both in the third world and in the imperial core. And we're going to also talk about how food sovereignty, socialism, and nutrition, going back to our roots, going back to indigenous, Afro-Indigenous teachings about nutrition and food and respect and convivencia with the land, can help us out of this mess, because it sure is a big mess. So much problems with health and obesity and heart disease. And contrary to popular belief, heart disease, diabetes are responsible for way more deaths than a lot of the stuff that's out there right now. So this is something that's important to mention. And joining us today are three guests. We got compañera Ofelia Carrillo, who's my girlfriend, my partner, my lovely partner here in LA. We live out here in the East Side. Ofelia is a Mexican historian and pre-nursing student from East LA. How's it going, Ofelia?
Hey, one second. Hey, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well on this Saturday. We're out here in LA, chilling. Sandino has decided to grace us with his presence for this episode, I guess. Hopefully he doesn't scratch anyone.
And also, Sandino is the third guest, by the way. Monisha is a Puerto Rican psychologist, social worker, and anti-imperialist veteran of the U.S. Army. Since 2013, Monisha has been investigating the American Psychological Association's 104-year role in the weaponization and militarization of psychology in service to imperialism. Monisha works to expose the psychological warfare component of U.S.-led hybrid warfare, with a special focus on the narratives used to destabilize people's movements toward liberation from capitalist imperialist oppression in Latin America and the Caribbean. How's it going, comrade Monisha?
It's going good. Happy to be here with you all and Sandino.
Yeah, he's gonna comment on cat nibble versus grass-fed cat food.
There's also a lot to be said about commercialized pet food, but that's a whole nother episode.
Most definitely. Well, thank you guys for joining, and I think it's a discussion that is important to mention because on this podcast I talk a lot about like politics and war and economics, and that stuff is important, but I think even more important as well is what we're eating, nutrition, and how that impacts us, because I think a lot of times like it's not really discussed a lot in mainstream media, but so many of the issues, like even just thinking about COVID and the pandemic, like so many of the problems connected to it are underlying conditions and diseases that are created by food, by imperialism, by junk food, that is horrible and is very devastating to a lot of peoples around the world, that creates really disastrous health consequences. And I think it's important to talk about it because it's not really covered from an anti-capitalist perspective. A lot of times it's either just personal choice, right? Or it's just focused on some really lofty, idealistic ideas about food security. So I think it's going to be a good discussion talking about nutrition from a socialist perspective and also other things like that. What I want to do is I want to read a few stats. I found this really interesting because I was reading some information from the World Health Organization, and this is some of the fact sheets, right? Because also like one thing I want to do is like a caveat to this discussion is like, I want to say, first of all, I'm not like the most healthy or fit person in general. I'm having this discussion from somebody who myself is trying to improve my health and exercise and work out and eat well. And so that's kind of the point of view I'm taking it from. But also as somebody who is critical of a lot of the postmodernist views that, you can be like, obviously like we don't want to like shame people. We don't want to like humiliate people, but to be obese is objectively unhealthy, right? And I feel like in a lot of liberal postmodernist circles, there isn't a lot of discussions, or if you have these sorts of discussions, you're like canceled or you're being, fat shaming or fat phobic. So I do want to give that preface, right? This is not intended to like shit on people who are obese, but just to be real about it, to have a good conversation, because if we want to be frank and honest, like obesity, heart disease, diabetes, these are some of the things that are killing off a lot of our people in the real tangible world. So we have to have these kind of uncomfortable conversations. So there's this interesting fact sheet, World Health Organizations, with some interesting key facts. I'm just going to read off some of them. Worldwide obesity has nearly tripled since 1975. Tripled. in a very, very short period of time. Think about that. 1975, that was like 40 years ago, a little less. That's nothing in the blink of an eye of human history. In 2016, more than 1.9 billion adults 18 years and older were overweight. Of these, 650 million were obese. So that's a lot. That's like over a sixth of the planet that's obese. 39% of adults aged 18 years and over were overweight in 2016, and 13% were obese. Most of the world's population live in countries where overweight and obesity kills more people than underweight. 39 million children under the age of 5 were overweight or obese in 2020. Over 340 million children and adolescents age 5 to 19 were overweight or obese in 2016. And interestingly enough, obesity is preventable. So it's something that we can do something about it. And obviously, like we're not gonna be like that capitalist mentality where we're just saying like, oh, it's all your fault, it's all your choice. But at the other hand, we have to provide a systemic analysis. Another thing, some other key points I wanted to share about obesity and people who are overweight is that a lot of the people who are facing rising obesity and being overweight are in the global south, are in Asia, Africa, Latin America. And within the imperial core, a lot of the highest obesity rates are from people from those regions, with the exception of Asia. But African American, Black communities and Latino communities in the US have some of the highest obesity rates, as well as poor working class white people in the US who have high obesity rates, rural whites. And we have to think about that. Like, why is that, right? What's going on? And like, why is it that working class people are going through this? So what I want to do is, kind of focusing a little bit on the international angle. What I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is from CGTN. This is about obesity in Mexico. And then we'll start off by talking about, with Ofelia, her view and her analysis of how obesity impacts Mexico and the contradictions, because we're talking about one of the most wealthy countries in terms of natural resources. Mexico has everything in terms of natural resources, yet the people of Mexico are being forced to consume these very highly processed junk. So we're going to play this clip and start getting some analysis.
When Mexico signed the North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States and Canada in 1994, the Zapatista guerrilla uprising warned Mexico would lose its cultural and economic independence. But no one predicted it would transform the Mexican diet and food ecosystem to increasingly mirror those of the United States. The traditional Mexican diet is a bloom of locally produced fruit and vegetables, high in fiber and devoid of industrial processes. Today, the norm is a bottle of fizzy soda to wash down any meal and an array of processed foods.
Yo sí les echaba, aparte del chocolate, les echaba más azúcar y pues que ya eran las galletas, por ejemplo, de chocolate con chispas, o que la torta.
Earlier this year, Luis Manuel Delgado was diagnosed as pre-diabetic. He ignored doctors' recommendations until his son was hospitalized.
Mis hijos empezaron a consumir refrescos como al año. Después del año sí ya les daba, les llegué a poner en su biberón. Realmente es muy difícil porque estamos en un ámbito donde, bueno, repito, ¿no? Donde tomar refresco, decimos ahí, todos toman, ¿no?
The increased prevalence of soft drinks in Mexico's homes and even schools has coincided with the introduction of foreign direct investment into Mexico under the North American Free Trade Agreement, known as NAFTA. In the first 20 years of the trade agreement, foreign direct investment into food and beverage companies quadrupled. One company that benefited from millions in foreign direct investment is FEMSA, a Mexican food and beverage conglomerate. Prior to NAFTA, they had a few hundred shops. Today, it's hard to walk far in any Mexican town or city without passing one of their 16,000 OXXO outlets. It's also hard to go far without seeing someone who's overweight or obese.
So really devastating stuff there. Really crazy to see that because, again, right, Mexico, you're talking about a huge country with very diverse agriculture from the north to the south with everything. And yet the people are forced to consume these garbage products. And there's so many psychological components to it, commercials, mainstream media. But, you know, even here in LA, me and Ofelia talk about this all the time. California, which is Mexico Robado, which used to belong to Mexico, the Chicano population here as well, high rates of obesity, a lot of people dependent on fast food. So maybe, Ofelia, if you want to talk about, you know, your view of obesity, capitalism, neoliberalism in Mexico, and also impact on Mexicans here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to undertake all of that, but I think CGTN put it really well. Like what happened in '94 with this iconic free trade agreement that most people know about, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Well, now it's called the Telcan or something like that, right? They changed the name of it, but the effect is the same, right? Where U.S. not only multinationals were able to flood the Mexican market with processed products, but U.S. agricultural producers. So what you had coming into the country was like, and still is, tons of GMO corn and tons of GMO primary foodstuffs. So that's everything from like, I don't know, dairy, corn, wheat, things that in Mexico were not to say that we don't eat corn. Obviously, we eat corn, but a lot of the corn that was eaten was from subsistence farmers, right? So you would have a way to support local farmers with local consumption, much of like what happens in Nicaragua now, right? Like, so small farmers could get by with like selling those things. But as soon as you had the highly, what the US and the World Trade Organization or the IMF disincentivizes in other countries, which is don't subsidize your agricultural production, don't subsidize social programs or public utilities, they do in the US. So in turn, when these, you know, big agricultural producers are able to bring those things to the Mexican market, the Mexican producers never going to be able to compete, right? And then they crowd out the market. Now the only corn circulating is this nasty GMO corn, right? And then the subsistence and local farmers have no incentive to continue producing, and you destroy, you know, localized productions of foods. And so Mexico, I think, it wasn't that recent, but like, you know, a few years ago, was entirely dependent on importing corn, which is crazy. Like the second largest Latin American country, like one of the birthplaces of corn, you know, now depends on or has only like very few varieties of corn, even within the consumption within the country. And you can get down to like the isotope, you know, of like what that is reflected of in people's bodies. And so I didn't know that. I learned that through a great book of this wonderful white man named Michael Pollan, who I tell everybody to read, Omnivore's Dilemma, because it's such a great book, like the way he's able to break down mass food production. But in Mexico in particular, you know, people consume so much corn and in so many different ways that Mexicans literally have different isotopes in their blood because of how much corn they consume. But increasingly, it's becoming more and more uniform, right? Because of the types of corn that we're consuming are sort of the same. And, you know, the biological diversity, even of our foodstuffs, is becoming more and more of monoculture. So I think that that is one of the biggest things of like, not only thinking about the processed goods, because yes, that's a huge thing, but it's also like even folks eating, you know, a very kind of staple grain diet. So when we're talking about staple grains, we're talking about like, you know, corn, yuca, plátano, papa, right? We're talking about starchy vegetables, rice, things that, you know, are carbs, complex carbs, but still, you know, good for what you need to be consuming, right? Good for your diet. So even those folks are getting things that are very homogenized at this point. So I think it's on many levels, I would say. Like, yes, the most obvious being diabetes, obesity, added sugar, and increased sugar intake in people's diets. And that's also in the US. But yeah, in Mexico in particular, the most alarming thing is children. it's like it affects children to a very large extent. And it's true, you can't really go anywhere without seeing like a lot of obese or overweight children, which is crazy because, we know that long term, the kind of impacts it'll have on their long-term health, even their lifespan, that's forever, and psychologically too, right? Like, and chemically, the neuroscience is there too to tell you that like having those kinds of added sugars like creates like this kind of dependency and this need for them that, I think some studies have shown that they have the equivalency of like addictive patterns as like cocaine. So it's like we would never give a child cocaine, but like, we're okay with them downing, 2-3 bottles of Coke and stuff like that. And it's also become what's most accessible. So it's also like the environment, right? Like now maybe, whereas before people would be drinking fruit juices or something like that, which were like cheap and readily available. Now it's like, okay, well, the cheapest thing is like, a 10 peso Coke or whatever. So I'm going to get the Coke because that's what we can afford now. And the local producers aren't producing anymore because they've been either crowded out of the market, or alternatively, the other thing that happens is that Mexico is very much the breadbasket for the US. Like a lot of agriculture is exported to be consumed in the US. So I'm sure many of you across the US have picked up a bell pepper or an aguacate and it comes from Mexico, It's not being consumed in Mexico, it's being sent off to the US, right? So then the other thing is like the availability of certain foodstuffs within the country where it's like, well, we'll get a better price, for this thing we're producing in the Western world or in the US. So we're going to ship it off, sell it there. But if you want to eat it locally, and I'm sure this is very much the case with a lot of big agricultural powerhouses in Latin America or in Asia and things like that, where like the really good kind of organic and locally produced things get pushed out to Western Europe or the first world, where they're out here eating, quinoa and chia and nopal, and then it's hard to get, within your own country. So it's just, there's many layers to it, and that's what makes it so nefarious.
Yeah.
Is that you can look at it on the micro level, but you can also look at it at the macro level.
Yeah. And shout out to David Soberg, by the way. David Soberg, with the honesty, full disclosure, I had a donut today. Thank you, David. That's fine, David. I appreciate the honesty. By the way, this isn't soda. It's just black coffee. It looks like Coke or Sprite or Pepsi or whatever.
Fake.
But but that's my weakness. When Ofelia was talking about sugar and crack, like for me, my crack is sugar. Like I love sweets. I love chocolate. I love like Snickers bars. I love ice cream. And I try my best to be real about it. Like during the week, I limit how much snacks and sugary stuff I have, and I'll give myself a day or two throughout the week to like actually do that. Moderation. Try my best to do that, and I think we have to do. And again, we're approaching this conversation from that point of view. What I mean, health for our people and modesty. But Comrade Monisha, your analysis. Maybe you can talk about. You're in Puerto Rico right now. Like, what are some of the health issues related to fast food and because Puerto Rican food, actually, me and Ofelia went to a Puerto Rican spot like last week. It was bomb. Amazing Puerto Rican food, delicious. We had tostones. We had some of the salad, seafood salad. It was bomb. But I know in Puerto Rico, when I was there myself, there's a huge influx of all these Western fast food companies, rising obesity, rising like people with heart disease. And, tell us about what's going on there with the role of fast food and empire.
Yeah, so pretty much we're a captive market in every sense of the term. And there's a Burger King, Subway, KFC, all over the place. You can go down one stretch of road in a small municipality like I live in, and it's like BK, KFC, Subway, boom, 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 So it is, as y'all were saying before, that when we take it right into the class analysis, and it is a luxury, but sometimes it's the only affordable thing to do. So right now, to go get fast food. So the way things have been working in Puerto Rico over time is that, the land that we would be able to use to farm our own food and so on and so forth, from the get-go was taken and used for monoculture for sugar, to produce sugar, right? And then when the US took over Puerto Rico, they wanted to also profit from sugar. So then you had other types of expropriations. For example, in Vieques, 2/3 of the island were taken by the US Navy in order to use for all but real war practices. And that happened for more than 60 years. And the same in the island of Culebra. So there are all of these expropriations and the theft of land that we would be able to use for ourselves to feed our kids healthy food. And then we also, I mean, we get aguacates from Mexico too. When we, my neighbor has an aguacate tree in his yard. So there's really no need for us to be receiving these imports, but we also have like the metropolis area of San Juan. We've got the mountainous regions. We've got all of these areas where people live and they cannot farm their own food. There isn't a local farm that they can go to, so they have to go to the grocery store. So a lot of the conditions that you described, Ofelia, are very similar to here in PR. Heart disease, diabetes is a big one, a huge one here. A lot of it has to do, we eat a lot of bread. Arepas made with white flour, not corn flour. But there's just, a lot of those same problems. And then you compound that with the Jones Act, and you compound that with the fact that we cannot negotiate our own trade with other countries necessarily as the colony. And then you have the influx, more land grabbing going on with more of these crypto colonizers, and every chance that we could have to take our land back and use it to feed our people. And there's a huge food sovereignty movement here. But still, our land just keeps getting taken from us and put to use for other businesses that make other people money and don't feed us, but then contaminate our environment and make it harder for us to stay well and healthy. So it's just this big web that we're caught in.
Even when I was living in New York, I'm from New York, and a lot of the Puerto Rican community was, because of imperialism and capitalism and poverty, a lot of food stamp recipients were Puerto Rican, and a lot of the food that they can get was only highly processed junk. And even within poor communities, like, they would only give out, for pregnant mothers, they would only give out like crappy food, and for young children they would give like powdered milk. And like powdered milk, especially in the global south as well, how it's used, just these processed synthetic junk that's distributed both in the global south and in the global south communities. And I think like one thing I kind of want to talk a little bit more about is the psychology behind fast food, junk food, imperialism. Because one thing in Honduras as well, where my family's from, this is a problem where you have companies like when we think about like Chili's or TGIF or Applebee's, like in the US, we're like, whatever, right? That doesn't mean shit to us. But when you go to global south countries, within the petty bourgeois sectors, or even within some working class sectors, to go to a Chili's is like, ooh, somos Americanos. Like, we're bougie, right? We're gonna dress up for Applebee's. We're gonna dress up for Chili's. And there's a whole theme around it. And they play into that. Like, this idea that by going to these restaurants, you're somehow more Western and advanced. And there's this kind of the teleology, like in philosophy, like the telos is like the destination, right? Where it's like modernization, they view the final destination of modernization as like KFC and McDonald's in every corner. And that's progress and that's development. But God forbid you have like, rice and beans or tortillas or whatever selling that in the street. Oh, that's backward. That's, that's old fashioned, So what I want to do is like, I want to play a clip. This is from this documentary. Me and Ofelia were watching this a few months ago, and we were just like disgusted because this is talking about how McDonald's advertises in schools in Brazil. And they have like even this creepy ass guy dressed as like Ronald McDonald.
They have a visiting program. So basically a school can tell McDonald's like, hey, we want you to come and like do this performance for the kids. And they sell it as like, we're performing for the kids, but really it's like one big fucking live commercial.
Yeah, so it's gross. I'm gonna play it, and then we're gonna talk about the psychology, because look at how they're targeting children, right? Like, I heard somewhere, I forgot where it was, that like there are so many kids who they recognize the McDonald's symbol and logo more than their last name. Like, that's fucking crazy. Like, the psychology of that. So I'm gonna play this clip. This is from a documentary called Global Junk Food: How the Fast Food Industry is Making Poor Countries Fat. It's really fucking crazy. So I'm gonna play this, and then we'll talk about that. So crazy stuff, really disturbing. Clowns freak me the fuck out, by the way. So seeing Ronald McDonald and creeping into these schools is fucking disturbing. I think Comrade, shout out to Comrade B Level. Comrade B Level said, was about to eat dinner. I can't after seeing this, the clown face of imperialism. Ill State Fishing said some sort of psychological positive reinforcement to connect happiness with junk food. Most definitely. It's something that's crazy. The psychology behind it is insane. Maybe we could start off with you, Comrade Monisha. I see you have a fourth guest on the podcast joining us as well. Your thoughts and reaction. You know, you talk a lot about psychology. You've studied this psychology of imperialism. Tell us a little bit about that, because I'm sure in Puerto Rico it's very similar, right? How they get kids from such a young age to glorify this junk food product.
Yeah, so I'm going to give y'all some background on advertising psychology. And the comrades are correct that linking happiness with the product is definitely one of the things that they do. So back before advertising psychology existed, the advertising psychology was born out of military psychology. Military psychology was born in 1917 as the U.S. was entering World War I. And propaganda was present right away from the get-go. So between World War I and World War II, military psychology then began perfecting this craft, and propaganda has always existed, but they took it to a whole new level. And naturally, capitalism needs to survive. It needs to sustain itself through profit, right? So everything that gets produced or created then gets marketed elsewhere, right? So everything that has been created within the military then gets twisted and marketed outside of the military to make more money. And the same is true with this type of psychology, with the whole concept of winning hearts and minds. So advertising psychology was created by military psychologists. So all of these tactics, right? Using the clown to go into the school to manipulate the kids, but innocently, to create a psychological, emotional connection to the product is the same thing that happens to people in the United States for military recruitment. It's the same proselytization. It's the same witnessing of the message. You know what I mean? So it goes deep, and it has a long, disgusting history. And yeah, in Puerto Rico, there's another layer to it as well, because these are things that are connected to the United States. So for, those who want to belong to the United States as a state, I'm sorry for the background noise. These things have that type of emotional attachment to them. For those of us who don't want to belong to the United States, they have a completely different emotional representation for us. They represent colonization. They represent imperialism and the destruction of our body, mind, spirits, all of it. So yeah, that's just a brief overview of a little bit of how that psychology works. But I mean, there's a reason why all of these companies have such huge lines in their budgets for advertising and marketing, because that's the only way that they can achieve any of this. And there are psychologists getting hired in all of these companies to make money off of trying to make them more money by targeting our kids. There's so much more I could tell you too about how this relates to imperialism, but I'll wait.
Yeah. What about you, Ofelia?
Yeah, that's super interesting, because as I was watching this, I was thinking back to that same book I mentioned previously about how a lot of the commercialization and mass production, modern food production, right? Because how we eat now, most of the products on shelves now didn't exist like 50 years ago. So a lot of that also comes post World War II, when the US military had to like basically get rid of a shit ton of chemicals and crap and packaged food they no longer needed. And so some genius had some idea of like, well, we can sell this shit to regular people and they'll eat it. And that's how you get canned soup. That's how you get boxed crackers. That's how you get dehydrated soup. That's how you get a lot of like the non-food food products, which are just sort of reconstituted chemical components. You can call it food because they have calories and stuff, but is it food? That's a whole nother question. But, their involvement also within that realm of like shaping what modern food looks like, what present day food looks like, which is why when you walk into a grocery store, if you go around the edges, it's usually all raw organic products, right? You'll have your meat, you'll have your produce and your dairy products or whatever, or even dairy. That's a whole nother universe of conversation we can have as well. And everything in the center, like that's all processed product, and like the history of like even fertilizer that was, it was supposed to be basically like a chemical weapon, and they just essentially remanufactured it to be used in agricultural production. So there's just like also many connections as well to the military industrial complex within food and the food industry. And also the fact that like after the US military, the second biggest pollutant in the world is commercialized food production. So literally flying things across the world to feed people creates so much greenhouse gas. Anyway, sorry. I feel like there's so many different connections, but in particular with kids, I mean, I think I was one of those kids, right? I was one of those kids who grew up in the hood, who, to me, my parents like were very, very poor, and like we had like nothing. And those like one exciting moment was when my mom, or when the small moments I had with my dad, when they were like, we're gonna go to McDonald's, and we were just like, oh wow, like we're gonna go to McDonald's, we get toys, and it was exactly like at an accessible price point, one of the few times we went out to eat, and it like immediately created like this moment of happiness within this tempest, which was my childhood. And it's so funny because Ramiro and I always talk about that, because he doesn't really like fast food. I'm not gonna lie, I like fast food. Like I don't eat it that often anymore, but I would be lying to you if I said I didn't have an emotional response when I saw chicken nuggets, because of like everything that we're talking about here in the present day. Now it's taken me a long path to sort of unlearn those things and realize, oh snap, that was me in some ways like emotionally like attaching myself sentiment and joy, to this experience and process, and then coming back and realizing, oh, that's really messed up. Because you go to a white neighborhood, or you go to an affluent neighborhood, you'll find a McDonald's. I'm not saying you won't, but they're few and far between. Whereas in the hood, you'll find them every other block, right? So I think it's also witnessing it from the other side as well, like being one of those kids. And you start to realize like how deep that, like I'm 30, I'm 30, but it still like evokes an emotional response from me, and it works,
Even like the branding, like the way it's like ba-da-ba-ba-ba, like just like all the little like gimmicks, and it stays with you. The branding of a lot of the fast food junk imperialism stuff that's put out there, the way it's marketed and branded, they know exactly what they're doing. For me, my vice, to be honest with you, obviously aside from sweets, like I love sweets and chocolate and all that. For me, it was also alcohol. Like I was a heavy ass drinker for like 10 years. And a lot of times it was the branding too, because you associate alcohol with like having a good time. So I totally understand when people associate food with happiness. I equated alcohol with happiness. So that's for me, like it was one of those things where I was just like, oh, okay. Like I always saw alcohol as like, this is my ticket out of boredom or out of solitude. And it's very similar with the branding with alcohol as well. And so I think that's important. And one thing that, something that's a recurring theme here that I think is really interesting is like one of the things that Marx talks about, Karl Marx, in Capital and all these different works. One of the dialectical categories is the negation of the negation. And what that means is basically that you have something that becomes its opposite and back, right? So what does that mean? So for example, taking the example of food, we can have, even here in LA, right? Let me sketch a picture for you here in LA. You'll have a restaurant, like even like a block or two from here, that will sell really healthy, hearty, nutritious food for wealthy white people. And chances are a lot of that food was grown in Mexico, was original to Mexico, avocados, beans, really like nutritious things that are grown there. And the wealthy white people there are eating at the restaurant are able to afford it. It's more expensive. They get the organic, the good stuff, and they eat that. So they eat the organic, nutritious food from Mexico. But then the Mexican who is washing the dishes and cleaning the restaurant and serving at the restaurant, they're eating at McDonald's. They're eating at Subway. They're eating at KFC because they can't even afford to buy the nutritious food that's from their own country. So you see how even though you have this nutritious food that is from their own country, it goes to the opposite. It's only afforded by the opposite, by the bourgeoisie or by the wealthy liberal elites. And then the wealthy liberal elites who are the ones creating these companies, right? They created Nabisco, they created McDonald's, they created Procter and Gamble. It wasn't our peoples and our countries that did that. They created that. They're not eating that shit, right? They're eating fucking like avocados and all this healthy stuff. So, but then they sell it back to us. So it's just interesting. It's like kind of like this negative feedback loop, right? Where it's like they're taking the best of us, right? And they're taking the best of us, and we're taking all the dump and all the secondhand garbage that they're giving us. So it's just kind of crazy when you see that. Even when we're talking about like fashion, this isn't even just food, right? We're talking about like style and fashion, like how you'll see some like white liberal hipsters like trying to dress like indigenous people or African people, but then like you'll see, some other people trying to dress Western. So it's just an interesting kind of dynamic and dichotomy that I find really fascinating from a psychological point of view, because I think so much of it is psychological. But kind of talking about some of the solutions, one of the things I wanted to mention is Ofelia didn't mention it earlier, but Ofelia is somebody who has been able to accomplish something that's really amazing. She lost like close to 60 pounds within like 2 years, basically, a little less than 2 years, changing her lifestyle, educating herself, reading, exercising. And so I feel like, kind of shifting gears here into solutions, because there's so many problems, right? Obesity, heart disease, all this stuff. Shifting gears into a solution, I feel like there's kind of objective and subjective solutions. What do I mean by that? Objective, meaning systemic change, right? Obviously, capitalism, as long as capitalism exists, the working class is going to be fucked over. They're not going to get the nutritious food that they produce and create and deserve. They're going to be fed poison and junk. So objectively, we have to get rid of capitalism. Objectively, we have to get rid of GMOs and all this stuff. Subjectively, on the individual level, we can make better food choices. We can start growing our own food. We can start having more better lifestyle changes, and psychological as well, like not associating foods with reward, or foods with modernity, or food with companionship. So there's so many objective and subjective things that we can do. So what I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is from my trip to Nicaragua. This is from my documentary, Nicaragua Against Empire, because one of the fascinating things about Nicaragua, the Sandinista revolution, is that the food sovereignty model is so big as part of the Sandinista revolution. 85 to 90% of the food that Nicaraguans consume is produced locally and within a very close distance, right? We're talking about a few miles, a few dozen miles, if anything. Locally produced farmers who create fresh, nutritious food and serve it to the people. No GMOs, good, clean, healthy food that's organic and indigenous to the land. So I interviewed this one Sandinista farmer who spoke about the importance of food sovereignty and nutrition. So I'm going to play this, and then we'll talk about things we could do to just objectively and subjectively change nutrition and get rid of junk food for our working class people.
la soberanía alimentaria, como bien lo define Vía Campesina, es el derecho que tienen nuestros pueblos a producir nuestros propios alimentos y que estos alimentos sean sanos y sean nutritivos. Muchos gobiernos asistencialistas ven el tema de soberanía y seguridad alimentaria como el abastecimiento, pero ellos no tienen interés de qué tipo de alimentos, si realmente estos alimentos son sanos, son nutritivos, están libres de enfermedades, están libres de productos químicos. En Nicaragua la soberanía que se está promoviendo es una soberanía alimentaria que fomenta en primer lugar la producción sana, la producción amigable con nuestro medio ambiente, agroecológica, orgánica. Esa es la producción, y que esa producción primeramente abastezca al país y después poder también compartirla, exportarla, ¿verdad? Con los países que la necesitan, pero queremos que ese alimento también sea sano para ellos.
So food sovereignty is not just about having food, but having good quality food, nutritious food. Maybe just starting off with you, Comrade Monisha, why don't you talk a little bit about the food sovereignty movement in Puerto Rico, what's going on with that, the urgency of that, and also any tips or thoughts that you have on what we can do in our day-to-day lives to avoid the poison of the empire.
Yeah, I'm so proud of our food sovereignty movement. Really, I'm inspired by it so much. So part of my rematriation has been reconnecting to the land here, or connecting for the first time, really, and learning about my relationship to food through my relationship to the land and vice versa. And our food sovereignty movement here has been key in recovery from the hurricanes, in the midst of like an acceleration in the aggressive disaster capitalism here. In Vieques, where my family's from and where I was living before, we have a Finca Alliance, a farm alliance. And it's really led by this group called La Colmena Cimarrona. And they do programs with the kids. They have a weekly market in the plaza. And they're really trying to involve the community and try to get people to come learn about composting. They have bees. So there's a lot of that effort. And can you ask me the rest of the question too? Sorry,
Yeah,
I got lost in my head.
No, it's all good. Tell us about the move. What are groups in Puerto Rico doing to build food sovereignty, and also what thoughts or advice do you have for people in the day to day to just improve their nutrition or to fight against junk food and this products that are put forward by the empire?
Right on. Thanks. So there, in addition to a lot of these fincas and the alliances that are all throughout Puerto Rico, there are also urban farms popping up. And one of the things I'm trying to do here in this project that I have, El Centro Solidario, is to do that because in my community, there's not the same thing that I had in Vieques, where there's the Finca Alliance and all of the wonderful, amazing things that you can go and get, to eat clean. So there are a lot of those types of efforts as well. And in terms of advice, I would say one of the things that I really love and respect about our food sovereignty movement is it doesn't shame people for not having access. That I feel is a phenomenon in the United States, where there's a lot of shaming and ableism around what people can and cannot actually do in with their material conditions. Not everybody can afford to start a home garden. That's expensive. And then you need to learn how to do it, and you need to have the time to learn how to do it, right? So being supportive, meeting people wherever they are in their own food sovereignty journeys is key. That's crucial, because you also don't want to create an abusive type of relationship for people, where suddenly they're turned off by all of this because they're like, no, this person's abusing me. I'm not going to learn from them. So that's what I really think works well here, is the kindness and sensitivity that people have when they're teaching people about how to change their diet, because in our culture there's a lot of resistance to that, you know, and just like there would be in any poor community in the States, right? Oh, you're coming from privilege. Really, access to clean food, as you've described, is a privilege, and so we're taught to view that way, and all of our resentment and animosity as the lower classes can come out in that relationship as well. So I think looking for ways to materially support, whether it's through, you know, if somebody says, hey, I'm interested in starting a home garden, bring some pots over if you can, you know, take some time to teach them how to start seeds, you know, all that stuff. And yeah, to me, that's just been key. And then, you know, poco a poco, in the midst of all that, you can weave in some political ed. And then that way teach people about, you know, why is this so important? You know, why, when the next time you go to the grocery store and you see, like for me, when I go, because I'm still recovering from COVID, and I'm also recovering from COVID while negotiating with an eating disorder that I've had since the military. So it's a really complex thing. Everybody is going to have a complex relationship with food, thanks to capitalism. So it's a healing process. And every time I go to the grocery store and I see that because there's no finca near me, I cannot buy fresh lettuce. I have to get lettuce that's imported from the United States in a plastic package. That's the only option that I have to be able to get greens, is to buy them wrapped in plastic from someplace else right now, right? Until I figure out how to grow them myself. So, like, coaching people through a grocery store experience, you know, because there's a lot of emotions too in going through that, you know, a lot of guilt and shame can come up for somebody as they're learning and trying to grow away from all this. And then they're faced with impossible choices. Like, I don't have a choice but to buy this or I don't eat. Same thing with boycotts. So, you know, the Goya boycott was a big deal in the States. Here, not so much, because that's the only thing that's on the shelves most of the time. So you either eat and feed your kids, or you don't eat because of some boycott from the States. You know what I mean? So, like, all of these things are psychological and emotional processes, and finding ways to kindly, lovingly encourage people and support them through what can be a very difficult process, I think is crucial. So now I'll be quiet.
No, it's all good, comment. That's excellent comments, and excuse me, thank you for sharing that, Comrade Monisha. Appreciate that. And yeah, it's true. And even myself, like, I have a lot of work to do in terms of reshaping my understanding of food and nutrition, and even just trying to grow. The only thing that I've ever grown and tried to grow in my life was like a weed plant like a few years ago. And I failed. my weed plant got too soggy and I wasn't able to grow. So I couldn't even do that, right? So we'll see. I've been thinking about trying to restart to try to grow stuff. Maybe start off small, tomatoes or something like that. And actually try it, like you said, right? Because everybody is at a different place, and I totally know, because like I'm from New York, man. Like I grew up in apartment buildings my whole life, in concrete. Like, I don't know shit about the outdoors and gardening and farming. So for me, it's totally new and totally like something that I'm not familiar with. So I really appreciate that honesty and just open mindedness to meet people where they're at. And it's important for Puerto Rico. Like, people forget that not only is Puerto Rico an island, but it's a colony of the U.S. and imperialism. And everything Puerto Rico purchases and can access has to go through the U.S. Like, that's fucking crazy, right? So even though you have countries nearby in Latin America and the Caribbean that it can easily trade with, Nicaragua being one of them, you know, they can't do that because of the Jones Act. They can't do that because of colonization. And they're literally being starved out, while, like you said, the crypto colonizers they have their avocado toast, they're stealing the land, they're thriving. So it's so obvious what it is. And it's like a silent genocide in a way. And food is being weaponized as part of that silent genocide. But one of the things, Ofelia has been taking a nutrition class. She's been learning a lot, and she's been studying the chemistry and the specifics of nutrition and how to eat better and choices. And like I mentioned before, like she was able to lose a lot of weight and healthy. So I don't know if you want to share some of your tips or what advice you have for people, related to nutrition.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of thoughts. This is a topic that to me, I'm very passionate about. It's very interesting to me. My parents are farmers, are campesinos. My whole family is campesino. It's sort of like a way to come back around to like my own roots. And I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud to say that my whole family, they're all rural land workers, obviously who then ended up in East LA. But I think one of the things that's also important to mention is, that as Monisha mentioned, like things can become really tone deaf, especially when you're talking about food without recognizing centuries of imperialism and colonialism, and that a lot of countries are monocultures. And what do we mean by that? We mean that they only produce a few staple crops. And that's because they were literally like massive farms, for the Western world for a lot of their modern history. And so that means that even within a country like Cuba, for example, which was dedicated almost entirely to sugar and tobacco, you can't have a change that quickly overnight in terms of like their domestic agricultural production. And that is the case for a lot of Latin America and a lot of the third world, so there's like that layer to it as well in terms of like how diverse can your diet really be if you cannot get it at an accessible price point. So there's that. Or like even when we lived in Ecuador, right, like they're producing tons of stuff, a lot of it either gets exported, or if you go into like a really bougie kind of bigger grocery store that normal day-to-day people on their wages like simply cannot afford, so they're stuck with very homogenous diets, which sometimes can even be healthier, right, than what wealthier people are eating. It just depends on how that looks. Because another thing is like that I don't necessarily agree with folks saying like, oh, well, this is our traditional diet. My traditional diet is like all these fried starchy vegetables, and I'm like, no, that's ahistorical, right? Because we know that a lot of the diet in many parts of the third world are kind of reduced versions of what the biological diversity of our native lands look like at some given point. We just don't have access to that gastronomy. We don't have access to that history because it's literally been erased from the face of the earth, So I think knowing that and then pushing a little back against that of being like, no, it's problematic if you tell me not to eat this because this is I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, take 2 steps back and just be able to have a critical conversation about what a national food diet is and how the construction of that. Because there's like a historical piece to it, there's a colonial piece to it, there's an economic piece to it, So I think that's one thing I would say is having an eye towards that. Because I think even for myself, I thought, oh, well, being Mexican means eating, red meat or cheese or whatever, or that's what I ate growing up, or that's what we ate when we went out or celebrated. And then it's also trying to understand your own roots, but not in a static way either. Because like you can want a hamburger. There is nothing wrong with wanting a hamburger. Go eat your hamburger, enjoy it, live it. Your diet or your food should really be about balance, right? Like giving yourself what you want, but then also taking care of yourself, being like, okay, well, I had my hamburger, but now I want to have like all these other things. Right. And to me, it really took a process of going back to like, what did my mom eat growing up? Lentils, beans, rice, nopales, things that you see as poor people food, right? You're like, oh, that's what you eat when you're broke. That's what you eat when you don't have money. And I'm like, no, that's when you eat when you want, nutritional density, right? When you want something that is going to give you like all the macro and micronutrients you need, but still give you enough calories, And you don't want to think about it in such a scientific way, but for some of us who have been so either overly emotionally attached to our eating or detached from our eating, it's important to know where you stand. So I think that's the first piece of advice I would give, like know where you stand. Like, okay, do I need to lose weight? Do I need to gain weight? Do I need to get more physically active, less physically active, right? Like wherever you are, you need to have an honest assessment of where you are, because change is not going to happen if you're not able to assess where you're at. And then the method of change or mechanism of change that will work is the one that is the most sustainable for you, period. That's it. That's all you really need to know, right? So to some person on Instagram, it might have worked to like time their meals out every 6 hours. To another person, it was fasting the whole day and only eating one meal. You know, it's whatever works for you in small increments that you're going to be able to sustain over a period of time. And that's really, if you think about it, not just for your food, any goal you've set in your life, right? Like, you know, I'm sure, Monisha, you did not become like a psychologist overnight, right? Like, you know, Ramiro, you did not become a journalist overnight. Like nothing we did that has value to us was immediate. And it's the same thing with our health. It's the same thing with food. It's the same thing with nutrition. It's small steps over time, knowing where you stand now, where you want to get in 3 months, where you want to get in 6 months, where you want to be in a year, where you want to be in 2 years. Me, I'm a writer. Like when I see things on a piece of paper, they become real to me. So to me, I like to write things out. You know, Ramiro's more like he puts it in his Google Tasks or whatever. Like he's more digital than I am. But, you know, whatever works for you that keeps you accountable, I think that's principle. And your motive, your why, your big reason why. To me, I was having a lot of health issues. I'll just be honest. Like I was having a lot of pain. I was like having like back issues, digestive issues. I had chronic heartburn. I had, you know, gastroesophageal reflux. Like I would literally like have to sleep sometimes sitting up because I would have so much acid reflux in college because of like my stress and how I was eating. And eventually I was like, yeah, I don't want to live like that. Like I had to sit there and really be honest with myself and be like, why is this happening? And what can I do? What's in my hands? Right. And it took me 10 years, you know, it wasn't also something that, you know, happened overnight. But once the pandemic hit, I was like, I'm home more, I'm still working. So I really do have the time to put things in motion. So I think those are a few of the things that I would say like really made a marked difference for me. And another thing that I think is important is understanding like the cultural elements and the lies that, you know, the capitalist first world tells you, like what kinds of foods you should be eating based on your class status, right? I think that's something that, you know, eat what is good to you and what is nutritious to you and what is accessible to you. If that's like getting canned food at the dollar store, then that's canned food at the dollar store, right? Like figuring out like where you can start and starting there, and there's only room to grow and improve, right? And then also cooking. I think cooking is a big one. I feel like you can't really get around it. You know, if you really want to take control of what you're eating and what you're putting into your body, like you need to start there with your home base. Like, what are you making? And it doesn't have to be complicated, right? Like you can go buy like low sodium, no sodium canned beans. You don't got to go cook the beans. You can work up to it. You know, you can definitely work up to cooking beans, but even that, it doesn't have to be hard. Like if right now it seems like, oh, I'm going to do this, but I'm cheating, or it's not, you know, if it's contributing and helping, don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. So be able to, you know, try things out and be consistent with what you're doing. I think those are some of the few things that, oh, and of course, I think also pushing back against like the Western diet or what people see as being good food, right? Like red meat or a lot of fried things. Like, I think that's something that even myself, I had to work through a lot. Like, oh, if we're celebrating, I'm having steak, or if we're celebrating, we're having this or that. And that's a preponderance across the world, right? It's not just like here, it's not just, you know, Western capitalist countries, whatever. Like even in China, like beef consumption is like really high, right? Or like certain parts of Latin America, right? Like the US diet has become very mainstream, like beef, very mainstream, right? Like that is what like eating meat feels like. But there are other, you know, protein sources that you can get. So it's thinking also about like what we've been taught or sold as convenience, and then thinking about how to work other things and rotate into our diet. And just like we prize biological diversity, and we understand that concept, I think a lot of leftists do, right? Like we need diversity. We need diversity in thought. We need diversity in our biological species. We even need diversity in how we move, right? Like you shouldn't be running every single day because you're only going to be using those muscles in that way. So you should be, you know, doing stuff for mobility. You should be doing stuff for endurance. You should be doing stuff for flexibility, right? And moving your body across different planes helps with that. It's the same thing with food, right? Like you should be trying to eat different things. And I see a lot of nutritionists say things like, oh, well, that's, you know, Western, or like, oh, it's shaming people because they can't get this or can't get that. And I'm like, okay, I just got to call bullshit. Like if you can't go into a grocery store and be like, I'm gonna pick a different vegetable today, it's not problematic to say that. Like, it is not problematic to say to people, that's a good thing. You should encourage that. If it's like only 4 or 5 things you have available, then yeah, work within what you have. I'm not saying you have to go to the health food store and, you know, go get amaranth or go get barley, or, you know what I mean? Like, but work with what you have there and try, and like, if you eat bananas every week, well, then get it, you know, oranges next time, or apples next time, or, you know, like, I think that's something that is I think there's also a lot of like, not, I don't want to say coddling, but there's a lot of like, oh no, people can't really do that. Oh no, people can't really do that. I'm like, people can. You know, don't shortchange people, right? Just because someone tells you that, oh no, they're not capable of that. Because I think in some ways it's also condescending, right? I think the tone is like, oh, people are not ready for that. I'm like, if someone's ready to make a change, they're ready to make the change. So I think that as we have this conversation, it just gets me really excited, because I really do like this, and I really do think that once you really consider like what you're putting into yourself and why you're doing it, right? Me, it was like, I want to live a better life. I want to take care of myself, because imperialism, capitalism wants you to eat like shit, right? Like, they want you, you know, to be weak, because it also weakens you physically. It weakens you, you know. They want you to be, you know, dependent on processed foods or sugar or whatever, and being able to really liberate yourself in that sense. And as Sankara once said, right, like, he who feeds you controls you. And that's true, even for yourself, right? So think about who you're patronizing. Think about, you know, money, that hard-earned wages that are coming out of your pocket. Who are they going to, you know? Yeah, I don't know. That was a lot, but
yeah, no, it's amazing. And you know, Ophelia's making me hungry. Let's talk about beef. She makes, that's like my weakness.
Oh,
Every time we go out to eat,
he eats so much meat.
I love meat, and my weakness, my crack is like meat and sweets, like ice cream. It's all good though, you know. We all have. I'm trying to do as best I can. I try to limit it to a few days a week. But yeah, it's a lot of good points, and even with the cooking, I definitely agree with Ofelia. When I started off, when I first met Ofelia, I couldn't cook for shit. I was horrible. I could barely make eggs, and afterwards, like, you know, we started cooking together, planning meals. I got better and better and better, and it's really cool. It's a beautiful thing to see, and for me, I get a lot of joy in making something that's tastes good, that's nutritious, and that people like. There's like an energy that when you cook like a really good home cooked, nutritious, delicious meal, like there's like a warmth of energy that other people get, and it's satisfying. Like, and even exploring dishes, like I've been making sopa de caracol. Ofelia helped me out a few weeks ago, which is a Honduran dish. It has like plátano, yuca, shrimp, conch, coconut milk. It's really good, and like I've been trying to practice it and get better at it, and it's good. Like, I like it. It tastes just like how I remember as a kid. And we gave some to the neighbors, we gave some to friends, and they enjoyed it. And it just like it filled me. Like, I was satisfied knowing that they liked it, you know. And the same with Ofelia. Like, when she makes really good food or snacks or like whatever it is, like, you know, she gets joy out of that too. And so I think a lot of it too is also rediscovering not only cooking for yourself, but also like rediscovering dishes that are indigenous to our peoples. That even Ofelia, like, she's been trying to make more Mexican indigenous dishes that have no meat, that are more like nopals, like beans, things that people have been eating for thousands of years. Rediscovering your roots, I think it's something beautiful, because in a lot of ways, culture and nutrition are passed down through food, you know, and it's something that is really beautiful. But I don't know, Comrade Monisha, it's been really dope speaking with you so far. I just wanted to see if you have any final thoughts or comments related to food and empire, your relationship with food, and any thoughts you have on the food sovereignty movement in Puerto Rico and abroad, and the importance of decolonizing ourselves from Western food, the way Westerners think about food.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great. I've really learned a lot from you, Ofelia and Ramiro, and been getting a kick out of the commentary from folks. Yeah, so going back to really lifting up the part of indigeneity in all of this, right? And decolonization in all of this. And something that shifted for me, thanks to a Lakota elder who I had the joy of cooking with one time. taught me, don't bang the utensil on the pot, because you want love to go into this food. You're feeding your people, and you don't want violence to go into the food. Be gentle. It's all connected, all the energy is connected and everything else. And I at the time was a practicing vegan, in large part because of the lack of ethics in the meat industry, and my own like dietary needs, but also being with indigenous people on their own land, in their own culture, and seeing the completely like different world of food that exists where people have sovereignty. And my relationship to meat changed too, because I wasn't about to offend my hosts when they served their food. And so it helped me come to terms with the fact that a lot of our conceptions around meat are also shaped by a very particular relationship that imperialism has with meat.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So decolonizing ourselves, and I saw a comment about hunting too, and I've hunted.
Oh, it's dope.
I can never do it again. I have to be honest. No disrespect to anyone who hunts. I've also fished. Fishing's easier, but yeah, like
that's one of our goals.
My heart can't take hunting mammals. But I that whole experience as well was sorry about that.
It's all good. They're like wilding out. No, it's all good. Yeah, hunting is beautiful.
Yeah, but I made sure that every single piece of that animal that was edible, even though it took me a year and some of it had to be frozen and everything else, I did not take for granted the life that I took to give myself more life. Stayed with her through the entire processing, So I think there are many ways to change our relationship to imperialism by changing our relationship to food and supporting one another through the process. So I'm just really encouraged by all the different ways that we can do that. Oh, and I want to recommend a documentary to people, because something that's associated with the imperialist food industry is the plastic industry. So changing our relationship to food will also change our relationship to plastic, which will change our relationship to the oil industry, because plastic comes from petroleum, which will change our relationship again to the military industrial complex. So the movie is called The Story of Plastic.
Okay.
The Story of Plastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you find the link to it, Ramiro could probably add it in the comments of this video after, so folks can have that as a resource.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, anything you want to say before we wrap up?
So much, and I don't want to make the stream go on longer, because I could
it.
talk about this for the rest of my life practically. But because we also watched a lot of documentaries on centralized feeding operations, or centralized animal feeding operations, which is now sort of the protocol for growing particularly beef, pork, and chicken in the US. And those are the kind of basically how most meat is produced in the US, actually. And they're cropping up everywhere, like India, China. It's not just a US problem anymore, but it's the same thing, the mechanism of profit put to food, which is to produce as much as you can with as little cost as possible, with no regard for the environmental impact or the way our body's going to metabolize those kinds of animals that have been pumped up with antibiotics and hormones. And there's just a host of problems that comes from eating that type of meat. And which is why I agree with you, Monisha, is also understanding where our food is coming from, and having deference, right, for those animals that were then sacrificed on your behalf for you to eat, for you to consume. Which is not to say you got to go and have but no, really, our people deadass had rituals for eating an entire animal, and there was a reason, right? There was a reason, to honor that sacrifice, to honor that life, and to give that animal a life with dignity, before you consume them, right? Which is also, I think before me, I was also, very much like when I saw my mom, when I was like 13 years old in Mexico, like, degollar, or like, how do you say that in English? Degollar, decapitate, I think it's right. A chicken. And I was like, oh, Mom, I can do that, blah, blah. And she's like, you eat chicken nuggets. Like, how do you think the chickens end up on your plate? And it was just like a revelation of, just how in many ways we're very disassociated and removed from our food. And I think anything that we can do, which is why we're both like, oh, that's so dope that you've hunted, because we think of it not as like a sport to kill, it's more like getting more in touch with your food, whether that's farming, whether that's, going to the farmer's market, whether that is, picking up a subscription box from local farmers, or it doesn't have to be like the most like, I'm gonna go back, back to the land and never buy produce ever again. Like, if that's you, cool. Like, that's not gonna be most people. Like, in modernity, that's a little, it's a little unrealistic. If that's you, I'm all for it. I support it. That's awesome. That's our goal at some point. But until you get there, like, whatever you can do, whatever increments or steps in between will exactly all help get us one step closer to removing our dependency from all these overarching and interlapping systems in the superstructure of oppression, whether it's like the logistics of food or the production of food, getting food to market. Like, all of these things have such an impact on both levels. So yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I totally respect that you've done that. That's one of our big goals, actually, is to go hunting at some point, because yeah, I think you should have utmost respect for anything that's a living being that ends up in your body. And both of Ramiro and I, like, we're very at this point have become, yes, a bit bougie about like our eggs or our meat, and we have a freaking subscription to
even
like
Sandino too.
Butcher's Box, but it does mean we eat meat less often, right? Because we're just like, okay, we're just gonna eat it when we know it has been had a decent life, has been raised humanely, and if that means you eat less meat, that so be it, and it probably will be better for you.
Yeah, even our cat, like, his fur is so.
Yeah, even our cat. Like, it's crazy to say, we buy my man's grass-fed beef and and grass-fed chicken from New Zealand, and
yeah,
he probably eats better than most people I know. So, but we knew when we brought that life into our home that we wanted, and some of our friends are like, "Oh, that's crazy! Like, why would you spend so much for like a can of cat food or whatever you're feeding him?" And I'm like, because that is a responsibility we took on, and they deserve to live same quality of life that we would. And a lot of pets are obese because they get fed all these crappy grains that they don't need. Like, cats are obligate carnivores. That means that they only eat meat. That's not like that's just physiologically cat physiology. You ever seen a lion have a piece of corn,
kale salad,
a piece of bread? No. What do lions eat? Meat. What do cougars eat? Meat. Like, and cats, it's the same way. It even goes as far down as like the pet food industry, which is a whole nother like. Anyway.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
No,
could I? I'm sorry, Romeo.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Okay, everybody say this with me: health does not equal bougie.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just because the bougies have put a price point on health doesn't make you bougie for doing what you have to do to be healthy and to keep your pets healthy too. Their lives are also worth respecting, and they shouldn't eat shit like we eat shit, right?
Yeah.
It's all right. Thank you. I just had to say that.
It's funny, we're on the same wavelength, because I was just actually about to say that. Because a lot of people,
that's true.
Because a lot of people on the left, like, I think this also harkens to a bigger problem within the first world Western left, that they think socialism is about poverty and about bringing everyone down, but socialism is about bringing people up. Every working class people should have good food. Working class people should have good housing. They should have the basics, right? It's not about, oh, you have that, oh, you're counter-revolution. It's like, it's such a juvenile view of socialism. And that's why I think places like China and other places, like, that are building socialism have been so successful because they understand that when you lift the living standards of people and you give people a good quality of life, good food, good quality housing, the basic human rights, people are going to support you. They're going to support socialism. And we have to get out of this mentality that like taking care of yourself or trying to get the best quality food is bougie or that it's counter-revolutionary. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Socialism is about improving the standards of living of people, bringing control back to the working class. And also, even in Capital, like as I'm reading, I just finished volume 1. I still have 2 more volumes. But one of the beautiful things that Marx says in terms of envisioning communism is this idea that because your labor, there's no division between mental and physical labor. Because you are the owner of your own labor, you can hunt during the day and write at night. You can grow your own food. You can do all these things. You're in control of the food that you eat and grow and do it collectively in a way that you're not isolated from that process, right? And so I even envision like in a future communist society, these different homestead communes, like everyone having their own piece of land, especially now with technology being so decentralized. Like there's so much potential for everyone to have their own little farm, and they can collectively, share some part of it together, keep some for themselves, and just be more connected to their food process system. And I think that's one of the ways that we can begin to really have respect for land, for animals, and see ourselves as part of this beautiful cycle that is life and the ecosystem that we are just extensions of, right? We're not separate and superior. We are extensions of nature. And Marx talks about that as well in Capital. Like humans are extensions of nature. We're not external and above nature. We're in it, so we have to form part of it. And this is part of what forms the concept of convivencia that they talk about in Nicaragua with the Sandinista revolution. They talk about in Bolivia, Evo Morales talks about, which is based, by the way, because one of the few countries that totally banned McDonald's and a lot of the GMO products. So it's really inspiring. I suggest people look at what socialist countries around the world are doing to reclaim food sovereignty. And there's so many beautiful things, in particular Bolivia, in particular Nicaragua, Venezuela and Cuba, DPRK, China. China there's more contradictions because there's also more of a market sector, but they're still doing, and it's also like fucking 1.7 billion people. But still amazing things, Vietnam. And so, there is like, even though there are these problems like obesity and heart disease, like there are models and ways out. And I think socialism, food sovereignty, nutrition, all of these things, the objective and subjective factors can be used. But comrades, it's been really dope talking to y'all. I'm not going to take up more of your time, but we definitely, some people are saying we should do a part 2 in the future. Great idea. We could probably even get the camera in the kitchen and just do like a cooking session or something like that. I'll try to make something. Cook something up. Do like one idea. I was telling to Comrade Libre, we were like, yo, we should start like a sazón socialista, like a socialist cooking channel to talk about food and socialism. I think it's a really dope topic. But thank you guys so much. We spoke with comrades Ofelia Carrillo and Monisha Ríos. Ofelia, my lovely girlfriend partner, is a Mexican historian and pre-nursing student from East LA. And Monisha is a Puerto Rican psychologist, social worker, and anti-imperialist veteran of the U.S. Army who has done a lot of amazing work and is active in people's movements toward liberation from capitalist imperialist oppression in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you, comrades, so much. I really appreciate speaking with you. I'd love to have you back on soon, Monisha. You're dope. And we're going to go out to some revolutionary music from Nicaragua Sandinista about food and uplifting some of the food that are indigenous to Latin America and the Caribbean. Peace out, everybody. Hope you guys have a great weekend and take care.
Compañeros, hay que sembrar la tierra. Hay que sembrar la tierra porque no habrá rincón de nuestra patria que se quede sin sembrar con el nuevo maíz, la nueva milpa de los nicaragüenses, rojo negro maíz.